Now, Economist and Managing Director at ESG Analytics, Sifiso Skenjana, speaks to us about the latest budget developments. Thank you so much, as always, for your time, Sifiso. Let's first talk about what the new budget should contain as VAT is off the table. As you heard there, the minister saying that South Africa can no longer afford to borrow.
Good afternoon, Tumisang, and of course to the viewers at home. I think I'll just start with the borrowing conversation. I think the language that the minister may probably be better suited to use is the kind of borrowing. I don't think we've got much room not to extend our borrowing program at this point in time. And as a result, if you remember in our previous conversations, I did allude to the fact that that 75% debt to GDP ceiling is definitely going to widen. And as we saw in the media statement that came out earlier on, there was a bullet point around the determination of appropriate borrowing strategies. And so I think that means that we certainly still have to extend our borrowing program. And to me, saying not all borrowing is bad borrowing as long as the borrowing is associated with good spending. The issue is that we don't see fiscal multipliers being attributed to the monies that we talk about. And what I mean by that is that when the minister talks about, for example, social spending, how do you determine between, if you've got limited resources, you've got R1, how do you determine whether to spend that on education or on hospitals, for example? You've got to have a view around what the impact or the budget appropriation impact or effect of that will be on the developmental outcomes that you seek to achieve. And so these are the things that haven't been previously articulated from a budget appropriation point of view. And therefore, then we are unable to say whether borrowing is good or bad borrowing. And so when we talk about we can't borrow ad infinitum, it means, of course, is that we can't borrow badly. But I think there's certainly something that really needs to shift now in efficiencies of expenditure that really move towards the, really impactful appropriation of our budget. And even if the debt ceiling does expand a little bit, I think we can get some developmental gains on the back of that.
Now, let's talk about the finance minister also speaking about cutting state spending. Where are the avenues for that? There's been some resistance, particularly on priority matters, but at the same time, the wasteful expenditure that many have highlighted as an ongoing concern.
So the wasteful and fruitless expenditure, it's quite an interesting one because from an accounting point of view, and if you just follow in terms of how the Auditor General sometimes does assessments, even at a local government point of view, that number from an accounting point of view can be looked at as wooden dollars because it moves in and out of the accounting recognition of the number. And so that number may or may not have necessarily meaningful impetus in terms of what it translates from an economic point of view. And when you also look at the composition of expenditure, of course, wages are a big issue. If you remember back to when Minister Mboweni was still there and he had promised us 161 billion cut in public sector wage expenditure. And yet when we heard in the last, budget 1.0, now we're at 3.0, we already heard the minister alluding to the fact that from a public sector wage point of view, you must expect inflation-related increases. And so that, in essence, government, without actually saying it out loud, that they've lost the wage bill conversation. And that's a massive component of the expenditure. And so then when you're asking where else do you cut, of course, social spending has been a massive component of our budget. Now, are there avenues to cut there? I think that we've got very limited space in terms of cutting in that. And then also then in terms of the support that we do give our parastatals, we saw that the government has now, in essence, de facto said that they're going to have a credit guarantee facility for our transmission infrastructure from an Eskom point of view. We already have contingent liabilities of what 500 billion associated with Eskom. They already also spoke about the support that they're going to give for Transnet, but they're not actually saying it in black and white. And so certainly, I think there's probably some room there to look at optimizing how that support is given at that particular level. And certainly, I think back to the point you made about expenditure, it is about efficiencies in expenditure. And so for me, the fruitless and wasteless expenditure is first and foremost just an administrative issue. We must first fix the direction of the spend. Is the spend getting into the spaces that it must get into, and then are we spending it correctly? And so certainly, I think there's lots of leakage from an efficiency point of view in terms of spending. And I think that's where really I think they must look at optimizing that at a rate at which, of course, it doesn't compromise economic growth. We're seeing now already Trump economy coming out with 0.3 percentage points decrease in their first quarter GDP numbers, certainly giving you a sense around where global economic growth is looking at. And so we have to look at a balanced economic growth context as we're thinking about expenditure efficiency as well, when we're thinking now, of course, in austerity 3.0.
The devil is always in the detail, and that's exactly what we'll be keeping an eye on in the new budget that will be tabled. As a parting shot, Sifiso, how much of the recent developments then dictate a new model of constructing a budget? Minister Godongwana touched on this matter earlier, saying there will be a need to legislate a different format altogether.
Tumisang, first and foremost, I mean, I remember really feeling quite eerie when the minister was talking about the division of revenue bill, particularly in the context of provincial government, where he was talking about the fact that once that money goes to provincial government, we hope they will spend it correctly. There's some amendments that we must start to look at in that provincial equitable share and the division of revenues bill, to ensure that provincial expenditure is aligned with national commitments from a budget point of view. And so what you tend to see right now is that once that allocation is done, the guys tend to, in essence, start to spend the way they think that is necessary to spend. And so I think there's an amendment there that needs to take, particularly, I think, at the provincial level, to ensure that when Minister Godongwana says, this is what we want to do from a healthcare point of view, translates into what province does. This translates into what province does at a schooling point of view, etc. And so I think for me, one big reform needs to come into that Division of Revenues Act and make sure that it's tighter and there's a higher level of accountability insofar as that is aligned with the national agenda in terms of budget appropriation.
Interesting times, and time indeed will tell. Thank you for your input. Sifiso Skenjana is an economist and MD at ESG Analytics, talking to us about those developments around Budget 2025.